The courtroom smelled of old wood and stale coffee, the kind of scent that clung to places where people's lives got decided by strangers in black robes. Daniel Carter sat at the defendant's table, hands folded to keep them from shaking, aware of every eye boring into the back of his skull. His daughter Sophie pressed against his side, her small fingers interlaced with his, and he could feel her pulse racing through her palm. Stanley Richter stood before the jury like a man who'd never lost anything in his life, designer suit sharp enough to draw blood, voice calibrated for maximum damage. The accusation hung in the air between them, thick and poisonous. This man manipulated a 91-year-old in declining health, isolated him from his family, and twisted his mind against his own grandchildren for personal gain. Daniel's jaw clenched. Across the aisle, his brother Marcus sat with arms crossed, face carved from expensive indifference. Their sister Victoria scribbled notes on an iPad, her lawyer's mind already drafting the next attack. Neither would meet his eyes. Sophie's whisper cut through the tension, small and fierce. "Daddy, we'll win, right?" The question gutted him. 9 years old, and she already understood that family could turn predator, that blood meant nothing when money entered the equation. He squeezed her hand, managed something that might pass for a smile, but the truth sat heavy in his chest. He didn't know if they'd win. Didn't know if doing the right thing would be enough when the other side had limitless resources and zero conscience. Judge Morrison's gavel cracked like a gunshot. "We'll resume Monday morning." Court adjourned. The room exhaled. Daniel stood legs unsteady and the world tilted sideways for a moment before righting itself. 2 months of his life had led to this moment, 2 months since everything changed in a lawyer's office that smelled exactly like this courtroom. Sophie tugged his sleeve, bringing him back. "Can we go see the mountain after?" The mountain, where it all started, where his grandfather had kept secrets for 67 years, waiting for someone worthy enough to inherit them. Daniel looked down at his daughter's hopeful face and felt the weight of generations pressing down on his shoulders. "Soon, sweetheart, I promise." But first they had to survive the war his siblings had declared. The bailiff called out a formality that echoed in the emptying room. "All rise." Daniel gathered the few papers Graham had left him, meaningless documents, in a fight that had stopped it being about law weeks ago. This was personal now. This was family blood spilled on courtroom floors, and Marcus and Victoria had made it clear they'd drain him dry before they let him keep what their grandfather had deliberately, explicitly left in his care. The memory hit him like a physical blow, sudden and complete. 2 months earlier, sitting in Frederick Morrison's office, while his world fell apart in the most civilized way possible. The leather chairs had been uncomfortable deliberately, so as if the furniture itself wanted everyone to leave quickly. Daniel had worn his only suit, the one he kept for parent-teacher conferences and funerals, and Sophie sat beside him in her Sunday dress, trying so hard to be grown up, it broke his heart. Marcus arrived late, making an entrance, all Italian leather and Swiss watches. The kind of wealth that announced itself in whispers. His real estate empire had made him rich enough that 50 million felt like a baseline, not an achievement. Victoria came prepared with 3 devices and the perpetual expression of someone mentally billing by the minute. Corporate law had honed her into a weapon, all edge and no warmth. Frederick Morrison had the tired eyes of a man who'd watched families destroy themselves over money too many times to be surprised anymore. He opened the folder with practiced efficiency, no ceremony, no comfort. "Shall we begin?" The first items were predictable. Small donations to charities their grandfather had supported quietly for decades. 5,000 to the Copperfield Library, 10,000 to Veterans Services. A year's salary to Mrs. Anderson, the housekeeper who'd cared for him when his body started failing, but his mind stayed sharp. Daniel noticed Marcus checking his phone. Victoria made a note, probably calculating the estate's total value, subtracting each bequest from her expected inheritance. Then Frederick's voice shifted, gained a formality that meant the real will had arrived. "To my grandson, Marcus, I leave the lakeside property in Grand Lake, Colorado, including all structures and furnishings therein." Marcus straightened slightly. Even trying to appear unmoved, satisfaction leaked through. That cabin ran $850,000, maybe more depending on the market. Prime real estate, the kind that appreciated while you slept. "To my granddaughter Victoria, I leave my complete collection of antique mining equipment and historical artifacts, professionally appraised at $520,000. Victoria's shoulders relaxed. She'd gotten what she wanted, what she'd probably already lined up buyers for before the body was cold. Frederick paused, and something in that hesitation made Daniel's stomach drop. To my grandson Daniel, I leave the sum of $5 in the original mountain property located at Copper Ridge, coordinates to be provided separately. The silence lasted exactly 3 heartbeats. Then Marcus laughed. Not a chuckle, not a polite deflection, but a genuine bark of disbelief that filled the room and stripped away any pretense of family unity. $5. That's barely a cup of coffee at Starbucks. Victoria didn't laugh, but the thin smile that crossed her face cut deeper than any sound. Cold satisfaction, the kind that came from watching someone else fail. The mountain property. Father, that structure hasn't been occupied in 4 decades. It's probably condemned by now. Marcus leaned back, still grinning like he'd just witnessed the punchline to a joke 40 years in the making. I'm sorry, but that's legitimately insulting. An abandoned shack on worthless land while we get actual assets. Daniel said nothing. His face burned heat crawling up his neck, but he kept his expression neutral. Years of practice, from his divorce, from custody negotiations, from every moment when showing emotion would only make things worse. Sophie's hand found his under the table, a lifeline he didn't deserve. Frederick cleared his throat, pushing forward with the professionalism of someone determined to finish an unpleasant task. There are specific instructions regarding the mountain property. The deceased requested that Daniel visit the site before making any decisions about its disposition. Marcus snorted. Disposition? You mean before he tears it down for scrap lumber? That's about all it's good for. The attorney continued as if Marcus hadn't spoken, voice level and deliberate. The property includes approximately 40 acres of mountainous terrain. The structure itself is, as noted, quite old. However, your grandfather was very specific that Daniel should examine it personally. Victoria gathered her things, the conversation already over in her mind. Business concluded, assets distributed, time to move on. Examined 40 acres of rocks in a rotting cabin. How thoughtful. She stood, heels clicking on hardwood, and paused at the door. The look she gave Daniel mixed pity with something uglier. Congratulations on your $5 inheritance, little brother. Try not to spend it all in one place. Marcus followed, stopping long enough to drop a business card on the table. Look, Danny, when you're ready to dispose of it, I know some guys who do land clearance. Might get you a few thousand for the timber and scrap metal. Consider it a family favor. Then they were gone, and Daniel sat in the suddenly cavernous office with Sophie pressed against his side and Frederick Morrison watching him with something that might have been sympathy. The attorney opened a drawer, withdrew an envelope. Daniel's name in his grandfather's careful handwriting, letters formed with the deliberate precision of someone who'd learned to write when penmanship mattered. He asked me to give you this. Said you'd understand when the time was right. Daniel took the envelope, felt the weight of it. Not heavy, but substantial. Important. The property coordinates indeed are in this folder. No liens, no outstanding taxes. It's fully paid and legally yours. Frederick slid a manila envelope across the desk. Everything official and buttoned up, the kind of thoroughness that came from a lifetime of practicing law in a small moment where everyone knew everyone and reputation was currency. A fully paid shack in the middle of nowhere. The words came out before Daniel could stop them, bitter and raw. That's something, I suppose. Sophie tugged his sleeve, her voice cutting through the fog of humiliation and confusion. Can we go see it, Daddy? Can we see Grandpa's mountain? Daniel looked down at his daughter. She had her mother's eyes, Rachel's sharp intelligence, but something else too. Something that recognized value beyond price tags, meaning beyond market appraisals. You want to see an old cabin on a mountain? I want to see what Grandpa wanted you to have. 9 years old and already wiser than her uncles would ever be. Daniel felt something shift in his chest. Anger giving way to curiosity. Humiliation transforming into something that might eventually become purpose. All right, we'll go this weekend. Make an adventure of it. Frederick Morrison smiled for the first time since they had entered his office. I think your grandfather would like that very much. That evening, alone in his apartment, after dropping Sophie back with her mother, Daniel finally opened the envelope. Inside a single sheet of paper, his grandfather's handwriting, shakier than he remembered, but still unmistakably his. The words hit like a physical force. Daniel, by now you know what I've left you, and I imagine your brother and sister have made their opinions abundantly clear. Don't let their laughter wound you. They see the world through a lens of immediate value of balance sheets and appraisals. You've always seen deeper. Daniel's throat tightened. He could hear his grandfather's voice, the cadence of his speech, the way he'd pause between thoughts like a man carefully selecting each word. The mountain property is worth more than they can imagine, but not in the way they would measure worth. Go there. Look carefully. Remember the stories I told you. And remember that sometimes the things that appear worthless hold the greatest value. The letter continued, each line stripping away another layer of his defenses. Trust yourself. Trust me. With love, always, Grandpa Thomas. Daniel read it 3 times, then folded it carefully and placed it in the drawer of his nightstand. Next to it, the other item his grandfather had left him, personally delivered by Frederick with instructions to keep it close. A gold pocket watch, heavy and warm, ticking with the steady rhythm of something built to last forever. The inscription on the back caught lamplight. To Thomas, time reveals all truths. Below that, a date etched in smaller numbers, August 17th, 1955. Daniel picked up the watch, felt its weight in his palm. His grandfather had carried this every day of his adult life, checked it 1,000 times, wound it with careful, practiced movements each morning, a ritual as essential as breathing. He'd seen it countless times as a child, learning to tell time by matching the hands to his grandfather's patient explanations. Watched him wind it at the cabin, sitting on the porch, while the mountain air carried the scent of pine and possibility. Time reveals all truths. What truth was waiting on that mountain? His phone buzzed. Rachel, his ex-wife, responding to an earlier text he'd sent when they still had cell signal. Hope you and Sophie are having a good time. Don't keep her out too late Sunday. She has school Monday. Another message followed immediately. Marcus called. Wanted to know if you were okay. Said you'd inherited something insulting from your grandfather. Are you all right? Daniel stared at the screen. Marcus pretending to care, performing concern, while probably already planning his next move. He typed back, choosing words carefully. We're fine. The inheritance is complicated but meaningful. Marcus wouldn't understand. He didn't expect a response, not really, but one came through before he could set the phone down. You always saw things differently than your siblings. It's one of the things I loved about you. Loved. Past tense. Their marriage had ended 2 years ago, not in explosive conflict, but in the slow realization that they wanted fundamentally different things. Rachel needed security, predictability, advancement in a career that demanded both. Daniel wanted meaning, purpose, connection to something larger than quarterly earnings and retirement accounts. Neither was wrong. They just couldn't build a life together. The divorce had been as civil as these things got. Custody arrangements fair, if painful. They'd managed to preserve respect even if love had bled out somewhere between the lawyer's offices and the division of furniture. But Daniel still felt the failure of it, the awareness that he'd let down both Rachel and Sophie. Maybe that's why his grandfather's trust mattered so much now. Someone believing he was capable of understanding something important, of being trusted with something valuable. After a year of feeling like he'd failed at the most important commitment of his life, that faith felt like oxygen in a vacuum. He set the phone aside and returned to the window. Outside, the city sprawled in every direction, anonymous and indifferent. Somewhere out there, Marcus was probably already on the phone with real estate speculators trying to figure out how to profit from information he didn't yet have. Victoria would be researching legal precedents for contesting wills, building her case with the methodical precision that made her dangerous. And Daniel had a letter, a pocket watch, and a mountain cabin that everyone assumed was worthless. He thought about Sophie's question. Can we go see Grandpa's mountain, not the property or the inheritance? Grandpa's mountain, like it belonged to memory and relationship more than deed and title. Tomorrow, he'd take her there. They'd drive through increasingly remote terrain until civilization fell away and the world narrowed to rock and sky, and the weight of secrets kept for generations. Whatever his grandfather had left him, whatever truth waited beneath that cabin's warped floorboards, Daniel would find it. Not for the money, though God knew he could use it. Not to prove something to Marcus and Victoria, though the thought had its appeal. He'd go for the same reason he'd visited every summer as a child, driving his mother crazy, with requests to spend weeks on that mountain with a grandfather who smelled like pipe tobacco and told stories about miners and lost silver. Because some places held meaning beyond function. Some inheritances couldn't be calculated in dollars. And because his grandfather had trusted him enough to wait 67 years for the right person to pass it to. The drive took 3 hours, winding through landscape that shifted from suburban sprawl to rural farmland to mountain wilderness. Sophie sat in the passenger seat of Daniel's Ford truck homework, forgotten in her lap as civilization disappeared in the rearview mirror. How much further? Her voice carried excitement more than impatience, the kind of anticipation that made childhood magical. According to the GPS, about 20 minutes. But we lost cell signal 15 minutes ago, so we're navigating by memory now. Daniel remembered this road, though he'd only traveled it a handful of times decades ago. His grandfather had brought him here maybe 5 or 6 summers during his youth. They'd camped for a few days, his grandfather telling stories about the old miners who'd worked these mountains, about the history hidden in rocks and ravines. Marcus had come once, complained about mosquitoes and boredom, and refused to return. Victoria had declared it too primitive after hearing Marcus's report, never even making the trip. But Daniel had loved it. The silence. The stars at night so dense they looked like someone had spilled diamond dust across black velvet. The sense of being removed from the world's noise and urgency, existing in a space where time moved differently. The turnoff appeared suddenly, barely visible. A narrow dirt road branching from the main highway, marked only by a faded wooden post that Daniel would have missed if he hadn't been looking for it. He turned and the truck bounced over ruts and rocks, suspension protesting. This is the road. Sophie gripped the door handle, equal parts nervous and thrilled. This is it. Grandpa always said if you wanted something worth finding, it wouldn't be right next to the highway. They climbed for another 10 minutes, the road deteriorating with each passing yard. Trees pressed close on both sides, branches scraping paint, until finally the forest opened into a small clearing. And there it was. The cabin looked worse than Daniel remembered, though maybe that was just the honesty of adult eyes compared to the romance of childhood memory. Time and weather had not been kind. The wooden structure sagged on one side roof, shingles blown away, leaving dark gaps like missing teeth. The porch had partially collapsed boards rotting into the earth. Built directly against the cliff face, the cabin seemed to huddle in the mountain shadow. Behind it, granite walls rose another 100 feet, creating a natural barrier that made the property feel enclosed. Protected maybe, or trapped, depending on perspective. Daniel parked and sat for a moment, engine ticking as it cooled. The silence pressed in, absolute and ancient. No traffic sounds, no distant sirens, no evidence of the 21st century except the truck itself. It's smaller than I remember. Sophie unbuckled her seatbelt, studying the structure with an artist's eye. She'd brought her sketchbook, he noticed, tucked into her backpack alongside snacks and a flashlight. It's like something from a storybook. They approached, carefully testing each board before putting weight on it. The front door hung crooked on its hinges, but opened with only minor resistance. Inside, dust lay thick enough to show their footprints. One room, maybe 20 feet square, with a cast-iron potbelly stove in the corner, cold and rusted. A simple wooden table with one remaining chair, legs uneven on the warped floor. Shelves along one wall empty except for a few tin cups and plates dulled by time. A narrow door frame led to what might have once been a sleeping alcove, now empty except for shadows. This is what Uncle Marcus and Aunt Victoria laughed about. Sophie's voice held confusion more than judgment, like she couldn't quite reconcile the cruelty with the reality. This is it. She walked slowly around the space, footsteps leaving prints in the dust like fossil records of her passage. When she stopped by the window and wiped a circle in the grime with her sleeve, afternoon light streamed through illuminating particles that danced in the beam. But Grandpa loved it here. Not a question, a statement of faith. He did. Then it must be special, somehow. Daniel smiled despite the weight in his chest. 9 years old, and she understood what Marcus and Victoria, for all their education and success, had never grasped. Value existed beyond market price. Meaning transcended monetary worth. Grandpa was smart. He wouldn't love something that was just old and broken. While Sophie explored, Daniel began a more systematic examination. He told himself this trip was about closure, about honoring his grandfather's request to visit. But standing here now, remembering the note, looked carefully, he found himself searching for something without knowing what. The walls were solid, the timber aged but not rotted. The stove, though rusted, was well made, probably worth something to an antique collector. The shelves held nothing of interest. He was about to give up when Sophie called from the alcove. "Daddy, come look at this." She knelt in the corner, pointing at something on the floor. Daniel joined her and saw what had caught her attention. A small metal tin, the kind that might have held tobacco or tea, wedged between two floorboards and barely visible beneath decades of accumulated dust. He worked it free carefully. Inside, protected from moisture by a layer of wax paper, were photographs. The first showed his grandfather as a young man, maybe 30 years old, standing with a group of other men in front of this very cabin. All wore work clothes and hard hats. Miners, Daniel realized, or prospectors. The second photograph showed his grandfather, alone older, standing in the same spot but decades later. He was smiling, holding something in his hands, but the image was too faded to make out what. The third photograph stopped Daniel's breath in his chest. It showed a young boy himself standing next to his grandfather, right here in this cabin. Daniel couldn't have been more than 10. He remembered that visit now, though he'd forgotten this photograph existed. His grandfather had his arm around Daniel's shoulders, and both were smiling at the camera with genuine joy. "That's you." Sophie's delight was infectious, pulling him back from the edge of overwhelming emotion. "That's me." He studied the image, searching his memory. What had they done that day? They'd explored. He remembered that much. His grandfather had shown him the mountain, taught him about minerals and geology. Had they found something, discovered something, the memory wouldn't quite surface, staying frustratingly out of reach. Sophie had moved away while he was lost in thought, was examining the floorboards where the tin had been hidden. Her artist's eye saw details others might miss. "Dad, this board is loose." Daniel set the photographs aside and joined her. She was right. One of the boards moved when she pressed on it, shifting in a way that suggested deliberate design rather than natural wear. He worked his fingers into the gap and pulled. The board came up easily, as if it had been removed and replaced many times over the years. Beneath it was darkness. Daniel pulled out his phone, turned on the flashlight. The beam revealed more boards below, but these ran perpendicular to the floor above, creating a crosshatch pattern that seemed intentional. He removed two more boards, widening the opening, and his heartbeat accelerated as understanding dawned. Not a crawl space, not a foundation, a trap door. Set flush with the subfloor was a wooden hatch, maybe 3 feet square, with an iron ring handle, and next to the ring, built into the wood itself, was a combination lock. Old, weathered, but still functional. Daniel sat back on his heels, pulse hammering in his ears. Sophie breathed out a single word that captured everything. "Whoa." He tried the lock. It didn't budge. 3 rotating dials, numbers 0 through 9. 1,000 possible combinations, each one as likely as the last. "Do you know the code?" Daniel shook his head, then stopped. Looked at his daughter. Reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his grandfather's pocket watch. He'd brought it without really knowing why, some instinct that told him to keep it close on this trip. Now holding it in the beam of his phone's light, and he read the inscription again. "To Thomas, time reveals all truths." Below that, the date, August 17th, 55. His grandfather's birthday was in March, not August. An anniversary, maybe. The date he'd bought this property. Daniel set the dials August 1st, 7. Held his breath, pulled, nothing. He tried again, 175. Still nothing. Sophie leaned close, studying the watch in his hand. "What about all the numbers?" "There are only 3 dials, not enough for the full date." She bit her lip, thinking with the straightforward logic of childhood. "What about just the year, the year?" Daniel's hands trembled slightly as he set the dials 555. The lock clicked open with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the dusty silence. Daniel lifted the trap door, slowly, hinges groaning from decades of disuse. Cool air rushed up from below, carrying the mineral smell of deep earth and stone. His phone's flashlight beam cut into darkness, revealing wooden ladder rungs descending into shadow. Sophie's voice held equal parts excitement and nervousness. "Can we go down?" Every instinct screamed yes. Whatever was down there, his grandfather had protected it with a combination lock coded to the year on his most precious possession. This was what the letter meant. This was what Daniel was supposed to find. But he also had a 9-year-old daughter to protect, and climbing into an abandoned mine shaft without proper equipment crossed the line from adventurous into reckless. "Not yet. We need proper equipment. Flashlights, rope, safety gear." He played the light along the shaft. The ladder looked solid enough, rungs secured to the rock wall with iron brackets. But beyond the first dozen rungs, darkness swallowed everything. "But what if someone comes and closes it?" Sophie's fear was real and not entirely unreasonable, though truthfully no one had been here in years. The dust told that story clearly. No one's coming. This place hasn't been visited in decades. Grandpa visited. She was right, of course. His grandfather had been here, had opened this trap door, had descended into whatever lay below. The realization sent a strange mixture of emotions through Daniel. Wonder at his grandfather's secret life sadness that he'd never shared it, and growing curiosity about what had been important enough to hide. We'll come back tomorrow, first thing in the morning, properly prepared. They secured the cabin as best they could and drove down the mountain toward Copperfield, the nearest town. Daniel remembered it as barely more than a crossroads, and time hadn't changed that assessment. Population maybe 400, most of them retirement age. The kind of place young people left and old people came to for the quiet. The general store occupied the ground floor of a two-story building on what passed for Main Street. A bell chimed as they entered, and an older man looked up from behind the counter. He was perhaps 75 with white hair and a weathered face that spoke of decades in mountain sun. His eyes were sharp, though missing nothing. "Help you folks. We need some supplies, flashlights, rope, basic camping gear." The man moved from behind the counter with surprising agility, already mentally cataloging what they'd need. Camping up in the mountains, getting late in the season for it. Weather can turn quick up there. Just for a day or two, nothing extensive. The man studied Daniel with the frank assessment of someone who'd lived long enough not to waste time on social niceties. "You're not from around here." "No, but my grandfather had property nearby. We're just visiting it." Something shifted in the old man's expression. Recognition, maybe, or curiosity. "Property nearby. What was your grandfather's name?" "Thomas Carter." The recognition lit the man's eyes like a match striking. "Thomas Carter. Well, I'll be damned. You're his grandson." He extended his hand, grip firm despite his age. "Clarence Boone. I run this place. Known your grandfather 30 years, maybe more. Heard he passed. I'm sorry for your loss." "Thank you." Clarence gathered the supplies Daniel had requested with practiced efficiency. 2 heavy-duty flashlights, batteries, a coil of climbing rope, first aid kit. As he rang up the purchase, his tone shifted to something more conversational. "Your grandfather used to come through here regular. Every few months he'd stop in, buy supplies, head up to that mountain property of his." Daniel's attention sharpened. "Did he say what he was doing up there?" "Nope, and I didn't ask. Man's entitled to his privacy." Clarence bagged the items, but his expression suggested he had more to say and was deciding whether to share it. Always figured he was doing something more than just camping, though. He'd buy specific things. Surveying equipment, rock hammers, that kind of gear. Not what you'd take for a recreational visit. Daniel absorbed this information, pieces of a puzzle he didn't yet understand falling into place. "Did anyone else ever go up there with him?" He said, "Not that I saw. He always came alone. Sometimes he'd stay up there for weeks at a stretch." Clarence leaned on the counter, voice dropping to something more confidential. "You planning to do something with the property? Sell it?" "I haven't decided yet." "Well, if you need anything while you're here, I'm around. Store's open 7 days." Then as Daniel was turning to leave, Clarence added something that made him pause. "Your grandfather was a good man, honest. Whatever he was doing up there, I'm sure he had his reasons." They found a small motel on the edge of town. 6 rooms, all available, the kind of place that had probably looked exactly the same for 40 years. After Sophie fell asleep in one of the twin beds, Daniel sat by the window and examined his grandfather's pocket watch again by lamplight. Time reveals all truths. What truth was hidden in that shaft beneath the cabin? He pulled out the photographs they'd found in the tins, studied them more carefully now. In the image of his grandfather with the mining crew, he noticed details he'd missed before. The men looked serious, purposeful. This wasn't a casual gathering. This was work. And behind them, barely visible in the photograph's background, was the cabin door standing open, revealing darkness inside. Had the trap door existed even then? Had his grandfather found it or built it? The photograph of young Daniel with his grandfather held his attention longest. He remembered that day now, or pieces of it. His grandfather teaching him about different types of rock formations, showing him how to identify minerals. But more than the lessons, Daniel remembered the feeling. Being seen, being valued, being trusted with knowledge his grandfather considered important. His siblings had never had that connection. Marcus and Victoria had visited, once complained about the isolation, and never returned. But Daniel had come back summer after summer until he was 15 or 16, until teenage life pulled him in other directions, and the mountain became something from childhood rather than an active part of his life. When had he stopped visiting? He couldn't quite remember. Gradually, he supposed the way children drift from childhood places and childhood relationships. And his grandfather had never pushed, never demanded, just continued his solitary trips to the mountain, keeping whatever secrets lay beneath that cabin floor. Daniel's phone buzzed. A text from Rachel received earlier when they'd still had signal just now coming through. Kenneth called me, wanted to know if you were okay. Said you'd inherited something insulting from your grandfather. Are you all right? Marcus, pretending to care, performing concern, while probably already planning his next move. Daniel typed back carefully. We're fine. The inheritance is complicated but meaningful. Marcus wouldn't understand. He didn't expect a response, not with the spotty signal, but one came through almost immediately. You always saw things differently than your siblings. It's one of the things I loved about you. The word hit harder than it should have. Loved past tense, a door closed and locked, but also acknowledgement that she'd seen something in him once, something Marcus and Victoria had never possessed. The ability to see value beyond price tags. Maybe that's what his grandfather had seen too. Daniel set the phone aside and returned to the window. Outside, Copperfield was dark except for a few streetlights. Stars blazed overhead in the way they only did far from cities, the Milky Way, a river of light across the sky. His grandfather had taught him constellations on this mountain, pointing out patterns and telling the old stories behind their names. What story was his grandfather trying to tell him now? Tomorrow, Daniel thought. Tomorrow, they'd find out. He checked on Sophie one more time, her small face peaceful in the lamplight, then settled into his own bed. Sleep came slowly, his mind churning with possibilities and questions. Somewhere in the darkness, an old cabin held secrets, and tomorrow he would descend into them. Morning came cold and clear, the kind of mountain morning that felt like creation's first day. Daniel and Sophie ate breakfast in the motel's small dining area, coffee and cereal, nothing fancy, then drove back up the mountain as soon as the sun cleared the eastern peaks. The cabin looked different in daylight, less menacing and more melancholy. Just an old structure slowly surrendering to time and weather, distinguished only by what it concealed beneath warped floorboards. But Daniel knew now that appearances were deceiving. Beneath the weathered exterior lay something his grandfather had considered worth protecting, for decades worth coating with locks and keeping secret from everyone except the one person he trusted to understand. They entered carefully, and Daniel removed the floorboards again, exposing the trapdoor. In daylight filtering through dirty windows, he could see more detail. The wood of the hatch was different from the floor surrounding it. Newer, better maintained. His grandfather had built this, or at least rebuilt it, in recent decades. Ready? Sophie nodded, though he could see nervousness in her eyes alongside the excitement. You stay up here while I check it out. If anything seems wrong, I'll come right back up. He clipped one of the flashlights to his belt, held the other in his hand, and tested the first ladder rung. It held his weight, the second the same. He descended slowly, checking each rung before committing his full weight. The shaft went down 30 feet, the ladder secured to the rock wall with iron brackets that showed signs of recent maintenance. His grandfather's work again keeping the passage safe. At the bottom, his feet touched solid stone. He swept the flashlight beam around and felt his breath catch. He was standing in a tunnel, hand-carved from the mountain's granite, maybe 7 feet high and 5 feet wide. Timber beams supported the ceiling at regular intervals, and the floor was worn smooth from years, perhaps decades of foot traffic. This wasn't a natural cave. This was a mine. Daddy, are you okay? Sophie's voice echoed down the shaft, worried and distant. I'm fine, it's a tunnel. I'm going to look around a bit. Don't go too far. I won't. Daniel followed this tunnel. It ran straight for perhaps 50 yards, then opened into a larger chamber. Here the mining work was more evident. Tool marks scored the walls where ore had been extracted, and against one wall, several wooden crates stacked carefully. He approached cautiously, half expecting them to crumble at his touch. But they were solid, the wood weathered but intact. He opened the nearest one and found rocks. Not just any rocks, but ore samples. Chunks of stone shot through with gleaming mineral veins that caught his flashlight beam and threw it back in silver fire. The next crate held tools, mining equipment, mostly hand tools, pickaxes and chisels and hammers, all showing signs of age and use. Antiques by the look of them, but well maintained. The third crate was different, smaller, more carefully constructed. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a leather-bound book. Daniel lifted it carefully, hands trembling slightly. The leather was cracked with age, but still intact. He opened it to the first page and read in faded ink, Journal of Elijah Thorne, March 1897, a prospector's journal. Daniel's pulse accelerated as he turned pages. The entries were detailed, describing Elijah's arrival in Colorado, his search for silver, his eventual discovery of this site. The writing was careful, educated, not what Daniel would have expected from rough frontier stereotypes. May 15th, 1897. I've staked my claim today. The vein runs deep, richer than anything I dared to hope for. But the mountain holds more than silver. There are signs of earlier inhabitants, the native peoples, who knew this land long before men like me came seeking fortune. Daniel flipped through more pages, scanning entries about mining techniques and ore quality, occasional visits to town for supplies. Then about halfway through the journal, the tone changed dramatically. August 3rd, 1899. They were watching, I'm certain of it now. Carson's men, or maybe the syndicate from Denver. Someone knows about the strike, must be more careful. The entries became shorter, more paranoid. August 19th, 1899. Move the good samples deeper into the system. Tore 3 pages from journal in case it falls into wrong hands. 3 pages torn, Daniel checked. Sure enough, ragged edges showed where pages had been removed, careful surgery performed over a century ago. The final entries were cryptic, almost coded. September 2, 1899. Hidden it where only blood will find it. The mountain keeps its promises. September 10, 1899. If I am found, let it be known I broke no laws and harmed no man. The wealth of the earth belongs to those with courage to seek it and wisdom to protect it. After that, blank pages. The rest of the journal empty, as if Elijah had simply stopped writing. Or stopped being able to write. But Daniel noticed something else tucked into the back of the journal. A hand-drawn map, not of the surface, but of the tunnel system. The chamber where Daniel stood was marked clearly, but the map showed 3 additional passages branching off. Passages he hadn't yet explored. He folded the map carefully and tucked it into his jacket pocket, then gathered the journal and several ore samples and made his way back to the ladder. Sophie's relieved face appeared above as he climbed. You were gone forever. 10 minutes, maybe 15, but I found something important. Up in the cabin, Daniel showed her the journal. Sophie handled it with the reverence of a child who'd been taught to respect old things, turning pages with careful fingers. Who was Elijah Thorne? A prospector, a miner. He found this place over 100 years ago. And Grandpa found his journal. Apparently. Daniel opened the map, spread it on the dusty floor. Sophie leaned close, tracing the lines with her finger. What's in the other tunnels? That's what we need to find out, but not today. He'd already pushed his luck, descending alone into an unmapped mine. Exploring further required more time, more preparation, and frankly, more understanding of what he was dealing with. A historical mine was one thing. A mine that might still contain valuable ore was something else entirely. They spent the rest of the morning examining the cabin more thoroughly. Behind a loose board in the alcove, Daniel found more evidence of his grandfather's visits. Battery-powered lanterns, clearly modern. A newer survey map with notations in his grandfather's handwriting. And a small notebook. The notebook was recent, dated from the past 5 years. His grandfather's handwriting, shakier than in earlier years, but still legible, documented his explorations of the mine system. East tunnel partially collapsed, unsafe for deep exploration. West tunnel shows evidence of water intrusion, possible underground spring. Main tunnel extends at least 200 yards. Vein continues, quality samples extracted and stored. So his grandfather had been actively working this mine, at least in limited capacity, right up until his final years. The implications were staggering. Daniel photographed every page of both journals, the map, all his findings. If something happened, if the cabin burned or collapsed, at least he'd have a record. As they prepared to leave that evening, Sophie asked the question that had been hovering unspoken between them. Are you going to tell Uncle Marcus and Aunt Victoria? Daniel considered his answer carefully. Not yet. Not until I understand what this is. They'll be mad if they find out. They're already mad. This won't change that. But even as he said it, Daniel knew the situation was more complicated. If this mine contained significant mineral deposits, his siblings would fight for a share. The will had been clear, but Marcus had money for lawyers and Victoria was a lawyer. They could tie things up in court for years. No. Better to understand the full scope before saying anything. Better to know exactly what his grandfather had left him before the family war began. They drove down the mountain as the sun painted the peaks in shades of gold and orange. Sophie fell asleep against the window, exhausted from excitement and exploration. Daniel navigated the winding road on autopilot, his mind already racing ahead to research and planning. He needed to understand what he'd found, needed to verify value-established legal position, protect what his grandfather had spent decades safeguarding. And he needed to do it before Marcus and Victoria discovered that the inheritance they'd laughed at was worth more than both of theirs combined. Daniel spent the week researching between classes. Lunch breaks dissolving into laptop sessions in the teacher's lounge, while colleagues talked about standardized tests and budget cuts. His students noticed the distraction. Jamal, the kid who actually paid attention during lectures about westward expansion, caught him staring at geological survey data instead of grading essays. "You okay, Mr. Carter?" The question pulled him back from 1890s mining claims and wire silver formations. "Fine, Jamal. Just working on a project." The boy's eyes narrowed with teenage skepticism, but he didn't push. Daniel appreciated that. The last thing he needed was questions he couldn't answer, attention he couldn't afford. After school, he haunted the Denver Public Library's microfilm archives. The Copperfield Gazette from 1895 to 1905 told fragments of a story. Elijah Thorne mining claim registered May 1897. Then 6 years later, a brief obituary. Thorne missing winter storm, 1903, presumed dead. No body recovered, no funeral. Just a man who'd vanished into white silence, leaving behind a mine and a journal with 3 pages torn out. Daniel's phone buzzed during his 3rd consecutive evening at the library. Rachel's name on the screen, and he answered, expecting logistics about Sophie's pickup schedule. Her voice carried an edge he recognized from their marriage. Something was wrong. "Marcus called me. Wanted to know if you were okay." Daniel closed the laptop, carefully aware of the librarian glancing his way. "What did he want?" "He said you'd inherited something insulting from your grandfather. Asked if I knew what you were planning to do with it." The question beneath the question hung between them. Marcus was probing, trying to gather information through the one person Daniel might still trust enough to confide in. "What did you tell him?" "That it wasn't my business anymore." "But Daniel, what's going on? You've been distracted all week." Sophie mentioned a mountain and a secret door. 9 years old and already unable to keep mysteries. Daniel couldn't blame her. The discovery had consumed his thoughts, too, crowding out everything else until the world narrowed to tunnels and journals and questions that multiplied faster than answers. "It's complicated. The property has historical significance. I'm researching before making decisions." Rachel's pause spoke volumes. She'd been married to him long enough to recognize evasion. Marcus sounded concerned, actually concerned, not performing it. That was the thing about Rachel. She saw people clearly cut through performance to motivation with surgical precision. It made her an excellent businesswoman and had made their divorce brutally efficient. "Marcus is worried I found something valuable and he's not getting a piece of it." "Did you, The question deserved honesty, but Daniel had learned caution the hard way. Information was ammunition, and even ex-wives could become collateral damage in family wars. "I found something that mattered to Grandpa. That's enough for now." Another pause, longer this time. When Rachel spoke again, her tone had shifted from interrogation to something softer. "You sound like you did when we first met, excited about something beyond the next paycheck." The observation caught him off guard, stripped away defenses he'd built since the divorce. "This feels important. Like I'm supposed to do something with it, not just sell it to the highest bidder." "Then don't. Marcus and Victoria have plenty. They don't need more." She ended the call before he could respond, leaving him alone with the microfiche and the weight of choices he didn't yet understand how to make. The following Saturday brought Vernon Ashby into his life. Daniel had found the retired geologist through academic papers on Colorado mineral deposits, contacted him through a carefully worded email that revealed nothing while requesting everything. Vernon's Denver home surprised him. Modest bungalow in a quiet neighborhood, not the mansion someone with his credentials could have afforded. The man who answered the door matched the house understated, functional, focused on substance over appearance. 74 years old with wild white hair and eyes that missed nothing behind thick glasses. He examined the ore samples Daniel had brought with the careful attention of someone who'd spent a lifetime turning rocks into stories. 15 minutes passed in silence. Vernon worked at a microscope in his basement laboratory equipment that would have cost more than Daniel's annual salary surrounding them. Finally, the old man sat back, removed his glasses, cleaned them with deliberate slowness. Mr. Carter, where exactly did you find these inherited property? A mine from the 1890s. And you have legal ownership of mineral rights. Daniel produced the deed, watched Vernon scan it with the same meticulous attention he'd given the ore samples. According to this, yes. Vernon set the document aside, met Daniel's eyes with an intensity that made him understand why students probably feared this man's exams. These are museum-quality wire silver specimens. The formation is exceptional. I've seen maybe 3 comparable examples in my career, and one of those is in the Smithsonian. The room tilted slightly. Daniel gripped the table edge, steadying himself against implications he'd suspected but hadn't fully allowed himself to believe. How valuable? The samples you brought today, conservative estimate $3 to $5 million. The number hit like physical force. Daniel's vision narrowed, sound dampening to a distant roar. But that's just what you carried in your backpack. If there's an active vein, if the deposit continues with this quality, we're talking 15 to 20 million. Possibly more. Vernon stood, poured water from a pitcher on the counter, handed it to Daniel without comment. The glass was cool against his palm, something solid to anchor him, while the world rearranged itself around new mathematics. The critical question isn't value, it's what you want to do with it. Extraction requires capital. You don't have engineering expertise beyond what one person can manage. You could sell to a mining company, but they'll strip everything. Museums would pay well for specimens this rare, but less than commercial operations. Or you seal it up, preserve it for future generations, and live with knowing you walked away from generational wealth. Daniel drank the water, buying time to think. His teacher's salary was $43,000 a year. Child support took $800 a month. His savings account held $8,000 total net worth, not counting the truck and whatever equity existed in furniture Rachel hadn't wanted. 20 million would solve every financial problem he'd ever have. Sophie's college fund fully funded. A house, not an apartment, where his daughter slept in the only bedroom while he took the couch. Security, the kind that meant choices instead of necessity. But his grandfather had protected this site for 67 years. Hadn't exploited it, hadn't sold it, had carefully maintained the tunnels and kept the secret, and waited for someone who would understand that some promises transcended profit. I need to explore further before deciding anything. The journal mentioned other tunnels areas I haven't mapped. Vernon's expression shifted to something like respect. I'd like to visit the site, do a proper assessment with ground-penetrating radar structural analysis. But Mr. Carter, I need you to understand something. He removed his glasses entirely, letting Daniel see his eyes without barrier. I'm 74. I have more money than I need, more years behind me than ahead. I'm not interested in exploiting your discovery. I just want to see a genuine find one more time, document it properly for science. You give me permission to photograph for eventual academic publication, names redacted until you're ready, and I'll do the assessment pro bono. Trust was a luxury Daniel couldn't afford, but something in Vernon's directness felt genuine. The kind of honesty that came from someone who'd stopped caring about games because life was too short for pretense. When can you come? Next weekend. And Mr. Carter, guard this information carefully. Once word gets out, you'll face claim jumpers, corporate pressure, environmental reviews, legal nightmares. Your siblings will seem friendly by comparison. Your grandfather kept this quiet for good reason. Daniel drove home through Denver traffic, Vernon's warning echoing in his skull. The silver Toyota 3 cars back might have been coincidence. Probably was. But paranoia felt appropriate when sitting on information worth $20 million that powerful people would kill for in earlier, less civilized times. His phone rang as he pulled into his apartment complex. Marcus. Daniel let it go to voicemail, already knowing what his brother would say. The message confirmed his suspicions. Danny, we need to talk. Victoria and I have been thinking about the inheritance situation. It's not fair. Grandpa clearly wasn't thinking straight when he made that will. Call me back. We want to make this right. Make this right. Translation. They suspected something and wanted in before Daniel could establish position. He deleted the voicemail and climbed the stairs to his apartment, aware of every shadow, every unfamiliar car in the parking lot. Vernon's caution had infected him with suspicion that would have seemed absurd a week ago. Inside, he spread Elijah's map on his coffee table, studying passages he hadn't explored. The journal mentioned 3 additional tunnels, east-west and something marked simply as archive. His grandfather's recent notebook provided crucial updates. East Tunnel collapsed unsafe. West Tunnel had water intrusion but was passable. The archive room held everything Elijah had protected, everything Thomas had preserved. Daniel needed to reach that archive before making any decisions. Whatever truth his grandfather had protected for nearly 7 decades, it waited in darkness, 200 yards into unstable tunnel. The next day brought Sophie back into his life for their weekend custody arrangement. She burst through the door with the contained energy of a child who'd been forced to sit still in school all week and now had 48 hours of freedom. Can we go back to the mountain? Rachel stood in the hallway behind her expensive coat and tired eyes. Douglas waited in the car engine, running, always too busy for the messy work of handoffs and goodbyes. Please, I want to see what else is there. Rachel's expression suggested she had opinions about taking their daughter into abandoned mines, but she'd learned to pick against trees. This wasn't the hill to die on. Back by 6 on Sunday. She has homework. After Rachel left, Daniel knelt to Sophie's level hands on her shoulders. I need to go back to the cabin, but the tunnels might not be safe for you. Some of them are damaged. Her face felt disappointment so pure it hurt to witness. But I found the trap door. I helped. You did, and I couldn't have done this without you. But exploring damaged tunnels is different from climbing down a ladder. The argument she was preparing died as she processed his words, intelligence winning over impulse. Can I at least draw the cabin? I brought my sketchbook. They compromised. Sophie would stay in the cabin drawing and exploring the upper level while Daniel made a careful reconnaissance of the west tunnel. Not deep, not risky, just enough to verify his grandfather's notes and confirm the archive room's location. The drive to Copperfield felt different this time. Daniel's awareness had sharpened suspicion, making him check mirrors, constantly notice vehicles that followed too long before turning off. The silver Toyota from Denver reappeared twice, then vanished. Coincidence, probably. But Vernon's warning had planted seeds of paranoia that grew fast in fertile soil. Clarence greeted them at the general store with the easy warmth of someone who'd lived in small towns long enough to value new faces. Back for more supplies. You planning to camp up there? Daniel bought rope, additional batteries, a first aid kit he hoped wouldn't need. Just being prepared. The property is more extensive than I realized. Clarence rang up the purchases, but his attention stayed focused on Daniel in a way that suggested calculation beneath the friendly surface. Your grandfather spent a lot of time being prepared too. Used to buy very specific equipment. Not tourist gear, professional grade stuff. The old man paused, weighing whether to continue. I run a store in a small town. Part of that job is knowing when to mind your own business and when to speak up. Your grandfather was a good man, honest. If he kept secrets, he had reasons. But if those secrets are putting you in danger, you should know there are people who've wondered for years what Thomas Carter did on that mountain. Daniel's pulse accelerated. What kind of people? Mining companies, geological survey firms. Few years back, Silver Point Corporation tried to buy up half the county. Thomas refused to sell, wouldn't even discuss it. They got pushy hired people to snoop around. Thomas got a lawyer, threatened legal action, and they backed off. But they never forgot. The pieces assembled into a picture Daniel didn't like. His grandfather hadn't just protected a historical mine. He'd actively defended it against corporate interests with resources and motivation to push boundaries. If they contact you, be careful. Silver Point doesn't lose gracefully. That night in the motel room after Sophie fell asleep, Daniel's phone rang. Unknown number, Colorado area code, but not one he recognized. Mr. Carter, this is Ryan Hoskins, Silver Point Mining Corporation. We understand you recently inherited property at Copper Ridge. Daniel's throat went dry. Clarence's warning echoed in his skull. How did you know that? Public records. Estate filings are available to anyone who knows where to look. The voice was professional, male-educated. the kind of smooth competence that made boardrooms feel civilized while executing ruthless strategies. We specialize in revitalizing historical mining sites. Based on geological surveys of the region your property has potential, we'd like to make an offer. $250,000 as is purchase close in 30 days. $250,000 for property Marcus had laughed at. The number would have seemed impossible 2 weeks ago. Now, knowing what lay beneath that cabin, it felt like insult. I haven't decided what to do with it yet. Mr. Carter, extraction requires capital you don't have. Equipment, engineering, environmental permits. $250,000 is generous for abandoned property with questionable mineral rights. Daniel's grip tightened on the phone. I'll think about it. Don't think too long. We have other options in the area. The call ended, leaving him staring at the darkened screen. Silver Point knew. Somehow they'd learned about his inheritance fast enough to prepare an offer within days of the will reading. Either they'd been watching his grandfather for years, or someone had tipped them off. Marcus. The thought arrived with certainty. His brother had probably contacted mining companies for property appraisals, accidentally painting a target on Daniel's back, while trying to prove the inheritance was worthless. He called Vernon, despite the late hour. Silver Point Mining just offered me $250,000. Vernon's curse was quiet but emphatic. They're circling already. That's a fraction of what the specimens alone are worth, never mind an active deposit. They'll offer you $1 million, next maybe $2 million, and by the time you realize you've been robbed, they'll have extracted $20 million and left you with legal fees. How do I protect myself? Document everything. Get proper geological assessment on record. Establish mineral rights clearly. And for God's sake, don't sign anything they send you. After Vernon hung up, Daniel sat in the darkness listening to Sophie's breathing from the other bed. $20 million in silver beneath a mountain cabin, and already predators were gathering. His grandfather had fought this battle for decades. Now it was Daniel's turn. Sunday morning brought Vernon up the mountain in a pickup loaded with equipment. Ground-penetrating radar, seismic sensors, rock analysis tools, structural laser measuring devices that looked like they belonged in science fiction. The old geologist worked with the methodical patience of someone who'd spent a career turning chaos into data. He ran cables through the main chamber, took readings, made notes in a battered field journal that had probably seen 40 years of use. Sophie watched from the cabin entrance sketchbook, balanced on her knees, capturing the scene with an artist's eye for detail. Daniel assisted Vernon, learning equipment operation through observation and occasional terse instruction. By late afternoon, they had results. Vernon spread printouts on a folding table he'd brought, reading subsurface scans like other people read newspapers. Timber supports are solid, several beams replaced within the last decade your grandfather's work. Main tunnel is safe for continued access. East tunnel shows significant collapse at the 50-yard mark, unsafe to proceed. West tunnel is passable, but water damage is evident at approximately 150 yards. He pulled up a different scan, this one showing density variations that meant nothing to Daniel until Vernon translated. The vein runs deep, at least 400 yards into the mountain, probably more. Ore quality appears consistent throughout based on resonance patterns. This is extraordinary, Mr. Carter. One of the last significant undiscovered deposits in Colorado, possibly in the entire Rocky Mountain region. Daniel's hands trembled slightly as he processed information that rewrote his understanding of what inheritance meant. Conservative estimate, properly extracted and marketed to museums and collectors, 15 to 20 million. Potentially 25 if you find the right buyers and document provenance properly. 25 million. The number was incomprehensible. Daniel taught American history to teenagers who didn't care. His bank account held $8,000. The gap between those realities and this new number was so vast it felt like different universes colliding. But extraction requires permits, environmental reviews, engineering. Upfront cost of 2 to 3 million just to begin. Vernon packed equipment with the same meticulous care he'd used deploying it. 3 options. Sell to a mining company, quick cash, but they'll strip everything and destroy the site. Sell specimens to museum consortiums, less money, but preservation guaranteed. Or mine it yourself, most profit, but requires capital and expertise you lack. The old man paused, met Daniel's eyes with uncomfortable directness. You mentioned Silver Point contacted you. They're vultures. They'll offer $1 million, maybe more, and you'll think you've won. Then they'll extract 20 million, leave a Superfund site, and you'll spend the rest of your life wondering if you could have prevented it. Sophie called from the cabin entrance, her voice cutting through the weight of decisions Daniel didn't know how to make. "Dad, someone's coming." Vehicle sounds carried through mountain air, multiple engines, too many for coincidence. Daniel's stomach dropped as two SUVs pulled into the clearing. Marcus stepped out, first designer outdoor wear, so knew the tags had probably been removed that morning. Victoria followed in business casual iPad already in hand, documenting everything with the predatory efficiency that made her dangerous in courtrooms. A third person emerged from the second vehicle. Younger man, professional camera equipment, hired documentation. Daniel moved to intercept them, angered and overriding caution. "What are you doing here?" Marcus spread his hands in a gesture meant to convey reasonableness. "It's family property. We have as much right." "No, you don't." The will was clear. Victoria's voice cut like surgical steel. "We're documenting property condition for our legal case. Public access to examine estate assets is protected under Colorado law." Vernon had stopped packing, was watching the confrontation with the wary attention of someone who'd seen academic disputes turn ugly. Marcus spotted the equipment recognition dawning in his eyes. "Who's this, and why do you need professional geology equipment at an old cabin?" Vernon's response was calm, almost bored. "A friend. Friends don't bring ground-penetrating radar to abandoned buildings." Marcus turned to Daniel, and something in his expression shifted from curiosity to accusation. "What did you find? Because clearly you found something." "Nothing that concerns you." Victoria stepped closer, lawyer instincts, sensing blood and water. "Daniel, we know there's something here. Our investigators saw lights in the mine activity, equipment deliveries. Whatever it is, we can challenge the will on grounds of concealment. Grandfather deliberately obscured the property's true value to manipulate distribution. He was completely competent. His attorney will testify to that." Marcus's frustration broke through polished civility. "This is ridiculous. You're a high school teacher making $40,000 a year. We're offering you financial security, a way out of that crappy apartment where you sleep on a couch because you can't afford a second bedroom." The accuracy of the attack stung more than the malice. "I don't want your money." "Then what do you want?" The question hung in mountain air, crystallizing everything into clarity. "To honor Grandpa, something you two never cared about." Victoria closed her iPad with deliberate precision. "We'll see what the court says about that. Expect a lawsuit Monday morning." They left in a spray of gravel and expensive outrage, but the damage was done. Daniel's hands shook with adrenaline, crashed the confrontation, having stripped away any illusion that this could be resolved privately. Vernon finished packing in silence, then spoke quietly. "They're filing Monday." Daniel nodded, throat too tight for words. "Then you need leverage. Something that proves your grandfather's intentions went beyond simple wealth distribution. Something that makes this bigger than family squabbling over money." "Like what?" Vernon considered Cho's words carefully. "Your grandfather's notebook mentioned an archive room. West Tunnel 200 yards in. If he kept documentation, there are records of what he was protecting and why that could change the entire legal framework. This stops being about inheritance and becomes about historical preservation, cultural heritage promises that transcend individual ownership." The old man loaded the last equipment case into his truck. "We should go now, today, before they can file restraining orders or freeze access. Whatever your grandfather protected, you need to know what it is before lawyers start rewriting reality." Sophie appeared at Daniel's elbow, backpack already shouldered. "I'm coming with you." "Sweetheart, the tunnel isn't safe. Grandpa's letter said you'd understand when you were ready. Maybe I need to understand too." 9 years old, and she'd cut through to truth faster than adults managed in lifetimes. This was her inheritance too. Her great-great-great-great-grandfather's promise, her great-grandfather's 67 years of protection, her father's responsibility to continue what had been started over a century ago. Daniel looked at Vernon, who shrugged. "Your call, but if we're going, we go now." They descended together, 3 generations separated by decades but connected by the same pull toward truth that Marcus and Victoria would never feel. Heavy-duty lights cut through darkness that had swallowed Elijah's secrets and held them safe until someone worthy arrived. The main tunnel felt different, knowing what it represented. Not just carved stone, but deliberate architecture, a cathedral of intention where every support beam was a promise kept every tool mark, evidence of labor in service of something beyond profit. 50 yards in, they reached the junction. 3 passages branching like arteries from a heart. East Tunnel showed immediate damage ceiling, sagging where supports had failed. West Tunnel opened into darkness that Vernon's equipment scans had labeled passable but dangerous. They took the West Tunnel, moving single-file Vernon in front, with the most powerful light Daniel in the middle, with Sophie's hand gripped tight in his. The first 100 yards were stable. Walls glistened with moisture, but the structure held. Then the dampness increased, became actual water seeping from cracks in the granite. Underground spring, just as his grandfather's notes had warned. At 150 yards, the tunnel narrowed. Vernon had to duck under a low beam that showed signs of recent reinforcement. Someone had shored this up, probably Thomas in his final years, maintaining access to whatever lay beyond. 200 yards brought them to what appeared to be the tunnel's end. But Vernon swept his light across the wall and grunted satisfaction. False wall. See how the stones are arranged, too perfect to be natural collapse. They found the seam pried stones carefully. Behind them, a wooden door with modern hardware, a combination lock identical to the trap door. Daniel pulled out his grandfather's pocket watch, didn't hesitate. 555. The lock clicked open with a sound that felt like permission granted across generations. The archive room was small, maybe 10 feet square, but completely dry. Battery-powered lights hung from the ceiling, his grandfather's practical engineering, ensuring whatever was stored here remained visible and protected. 3 metal filing cabinets dominated the space. Vernon whistled low appreciation for organization that would have impressed academic archivists. Daniel opened the first cabinet. Inside, hundreds of photographs in protective sleeves. Pottery pieces, tools, woven items, all carefully documented, with dates, GPS coordinates, detailed notes in his grandfather's precise handwriting. "Dad, what are these?" Sophie pointed to an image of a clay vessel, intricate, geometric patterns spiraling from base to rim. Artifacts, very old ones. The second cabinet held research. Correspondence with anthropologists, letters from the Ute Mountain Ute Tribal Council, dating back to 2014, academic papers about sacred sites and federal heritage protection laws. Vernon examined a letter, then looked at Daniel with new understanding. Your grandfather was negotiating with the Ute tribe, trying to return these items. The third cabinet held the document that changed everything. Draft agreement, professionally formatted, legally precise, between Harold Thomas Carter and Ute Mountain Ute Tribal Council. Terms that made Daniel's chest tighten with the weight of promises his grandfather had carried for nearly 7 decades. Ceremonial chambers, and all artifacts to be returned to the tribe. Mineral rights retained by the Carter family. Revenue sharing 10% of any mining proceeds to tribal cultural programs. Preservation covenant protecting the site from commercial exploitation. 2 signature lines at the bottom, both blank. Vernon read over Daniel's shoulder, then spoke with quiet reverence. Your grandfather negotiated this. Attached to the agreement was a letter in his grandfather's handwriting, the paper newer, dated just months before his death. Daniel, if you were reading this, you found the archive. Well done. Now the hard truth, Elijah Thorne was my great-grandfather. Your great-great-great-great-grandfather. He made a promise to the Ute people in 1899. I've spent 67 years keeping that promise alive. Now it's yours. The words blurred as Daniel's eyes filled. Sophie leaned against him, reading along, too young to fully understand, but old enough to grasp the weight of what they'd discovered. The artifacts must go back. The ceremonial sites must be protected. That was Elijah's vow. But the silver can secure your future, Sophie's education, your freedom from financial worry. The Tribal Council knows about this agreement. Contact Lawrence Whitehorse, Cultural Preservation Office. He's been waiting 7 years for someone from our family to honor this. The letter continued, each word stripping away Daniel's remaining defenses. I couldn't sign because my health failed. Now you can. This is why I left it to you, not Marcus or Victoria. They'd sell everything to the highest bidder. You'll do the right thing. Trust yourself. I always have. Vernon found the final piece tucked into a ledger book's spine. 3 pages old and fragile, the sections torn from Elijah's journal over a century ago. Daniel read them aloud, voice shaking. August 12, 1899. Met with Dakota, an elder of the Ute people. He showed me sacred chambers deeper in the mountain. I felt ashamed standing there with my greed, my pickaxe, and my dreams of wealth in a place his ancestors used for ceremony and vision. The second page continued the story. August 18th, 1899. Dakota asked me to promise, if I profit from the mountain silver, that I will protect what his people left behind, return it someday when the time is right. I gave my word. It's the least I can do for the wealth I'm taking from their sacred ground. The final page revealed everything. August 25th, 1899. I've hidden the artifacts in the deepest chamber. Dakota approves. He says the mountain is patient, that truth survives longer than men who try to bury it. I've hidden my best ore samples too. If dangerous men come, they'll find enough in the obvious places to satisfy greed. But the real treasure, both silver and sacred objects, stays safe. The mountain keeps its promises even when men forget how. Daniel and Vernon stood in silence. Sophie had moved to the photographs, examining each image with careful attention. These belong to someone else, don't they? The people who were here first. 9 years old, and she understood what Marcus and Victoria never would. Some things aren't property. Some debts transcend ownership. Some promises matter more than the wealth they might cost. Vernon began photographing documents with methodical precision. This changes everything. You're not just defending an inheritance. You're honoring a covenant that's been kept for 130 years. Federal heritage protection, laws, tribal sovereignty, historical preservation. Your siblings are about to discover they picked a fight with something bigger than family money. They emerged from the archive room as the sun touched the western peaks, painting the mountain in shades that made it seem on fire. Daniel locked the door behind them, pocketed his grandfather's watch, and felt the weight of 4 generations settle onto his shoulders. Elijah had made a promise to a Ute elder in 1899. His grandfather had protected that promise for 67 years, maintained tunnels and documented artifacts and negotiated agreements, while keeping everything secret from children who would have sold it the moment they learned its value. Now it was Daniel's turn to decide whether promises mattered more than profit, whether integrity could survive the pressure of siblings who had lawyers and resources and zero conscience. His phone buzzed as they climbed back to the surface. Text from Marcus sent hours ago when they were too deep for signal. Last chance, Danny. Work with us or we make this expensive and ugly. Lawsuit filed Monday morning. Vernon helped pack equipment, then paused before climbing into his truck. Whatever you decide, document everything. The artifacts, the tribal agreement, your grandfather's intentions. Make it impossible for anyone to claim this was just about money. After Vernon left, Daniel sat on the cabin porch with Sophie, watching stars emerge one by one. The Milky Way became visible as full darkness fell that river of light his grandfather had taught him to navigate by. Are we going to give the artifacts back? Yes. Even though they are worth a lot of money. Especially because they're worth a lot of money, something that matter more than what they cost. Sophie considered this, then spoke with the clarity of someone too young to have learned cynicism. Uncle Marcus and Aunt Victoria won't understand. No, they won't. And that's why Grandpa left this to me instead of them. They drove back to Denver through darkness. Sophie falling asleep against the window, while Daniel's mind raced with decisions that would determine not just his future, but whether a 130-year-old promise survived contact with lawyers and greed. Monday morning brought the lawsuit delivered by email before Daniel had finished his first coffee. Victoria's legal letterhead, Stanley Richter's signature pages of accusations that transformed family grief into commercial transaction. Undue influence, diminished mental capacity, fraudulent concealment of asset value. Demands for the will to be declared invalid property, divided equally damages for emotional distress. Attached were witness statements from people Daniel had never met claiming his grandfather had shown confusion in his final months. Hired testimony, manufactured evidence, the kind of legal warfare that money could wage against truth. Daniel called Graham Whitfield, the attorney Clarence had recommended. They met that afternoon in Graham's modest Copperfield office, and Daniel laid out everything. The mine, the artifacts, the tribal agreement, his grandfather's 67 years of protection. Graham read through documents with the careful attention of someone who'd practiced law as long enough to recognize when cases transcended normal boundaries. Your siblings are claiming undue influence, see? That's what they threatened. On what grounds you visited him more than they did, but that's not manipulation. That's family. Graham studied the geological reports Vernon had provided, the photographs of artifacts, the draft agreement with the Ute Mountain Ute Tribal Council. Here's what you have in your favor: a properly executed medical documentation of your grandfather's competency at the time, and a property that's clearly valuable. But more importantly, you have this tribal agreement. Federal law protects indigenous heritage. If the Ute Council intervenes as an interested party, your siblings will face complications they haven't anticipated. So what do I do? Graham leaned back, the chair creaking under his weight. First, contact the tribal council immediately. Get them involved, establish that this isn't just about family assets, but about cultural heritage and promises that predate modern property law. Second, we file a counter motion as soon as your siblings officially serve papers. We argue this isn't just inheritance dispute, but preservation of historical sites and honoring agreements your grandfather made in good faith. Graham pulled out a legal pad, began making notes. Courts look favorably on people trying to do the right thing, especially when indigenous rights are involved. Your willingness to return priceless artifacts while your siblings scramble for money will demonstrate exactly why your grandfather chose you. The retainer was $5,000. Daniel's savings could cover it, with $3,000 left over for maybe 2 months of additional legal fees if the fight dragged on. Marcus and Victoria could afford to litigate for years, but Graham seemed to read his mind. They're betting you'll cave because you can't afford to fight. Show them they're wrong about that and about you. Daniel called the number from his grandfather's files that afternoon. Lawrence Whitehorse answered on the third ring, voice warm but cautious. I wondered if this call would ever come. Your grandfather and I worked together for 7 years. I found the archive room, the draft agreement. I want to honor it. The pause on the other end lasted long enough that Daniel wondered if the connection had dropped. Your grandfather was a good man, honest. When he fell ill 2 years ago, we worried the agreement would die with him. His other grandchildren had no interest in anything except monetary value. They arranged to meet the following day at the tribal offices in Towaoc. Daniel would bring all documentation, photographs, the draft agreement. The tribal council would review and decide whether to accept his commitment or treat him as just another white person making promises that would evaporate when money got involved. That night, Rachel called, not about logistics or schedules, but because Marcus had contacted her again. He said you're involving Sophie in a dangerous legal battle, that you're being unreasonable about property that should be divided fairly. Daniel closed his eyes, exhaustion and anger creating a toxic mixture that made words difficult. Did he mention that the property contains sacred Native American artifacts, that Grandpa spent decades negotiating an agreement to return them, that this has nothing to do with fairness and everything to do with greed? Rachel's silence suggested she was processing information that didn't match Marcus's narrative. He said it was just an old mine. It is, with Ute ceremonial objects that belong to the people whose sacred site Elijah Thorne disrupted in 1899. Grandpa was trying to make that right. I'm trying to finish what he started. So it's not about money. It was never about money. Another pause, then Rachel's voice came back softer. Doug thinks you should just sell and split it. Doug doesn't get a vote. I know, and I think your grandfather was right to trust you. You were always the one who cared about doing things the right way, even when it cost you. The unexpected support nearly broke through Daniel's carefully maintained control. After everything, after the divorce, in the distance and the reconstruction of separate lives, Rachel still saw something in him worth respecting. Marcus is threatening to drag this through courts for years. Let him. Sophie needs to see that integrity matters more than comfort, that some promises are worth keeping even when they're expensive. The tribal offices in Towaoc were modest but dignified, a building that announced respect for tradition without performing it. Lawrence Whitehorse met Daniel in a small conference room, along with Franklin Whitecloud, the tribal council chairman, and 2 elders whose names Daniel didn't catch in the rush of introductions. He spread documentation across the table. Photographs of artifacts, his grandfather's meticulous notes, the draft agreement, Elijah's torn journal pages. Everything that proved this was about more than silver and inheritance disputes. Franklin examined a photograph of a pottery vessel, traced the patterns with one finger. My grandmother told stories about this place, the sacred mountain where young men went for vision quests. We thought the location was lost. One of the elders spoke in Ute Lawrence, translating. These belong to our ancestors. This is family coming home. They reviewed the draft agreement with legal precision, asking questions about mineral rights and revenue sharing and preservation covenants. Daniel answered honestly, admitted what he didn't know, promised to honor whatever terms they considered fair. Franklin finally set the documents aside. Your grandfather came to us 7 years ago. He was honest about what he'd found, what his ancestor had promised. We respected that kind of integrity. Why are you doing this? You could keep everything, sell the silver, pocket 20 million. No one knows about Elijah's promise except you. The question hung in air that smelled of sage and old paper. Daniel thought about his grandfather's letter, about Sophie's clarity, about whether promises mattered when no one was watching to enforce them. Because Grandpa trusted me to do the right thing, and because some debts transcend the people who incurred them. Elijah took silver from your sacred mountain. The least his descendants can do is return what belongs to you. Franklin leaned back, exchanged glances with the elders, then spoke with the weight of generations behind each word. We'll intervene in the lawsuit. Federal heritage protection laws give us standing. Your siblings are about to discover they picked a fight that involves more than family disagreements. Lawrence pulled out a revised version of the agreement, modifications made during 7 years of waiting for someone from the Carter family to honor what Thomas had started. All artifacts returned to the tribe. Ceremonial chambers placed under our control, closed to public access. You retain mineral rights, but agreed a joint management committee for any extraction. 10% of proceeds to cultural preservation programs. The terms were more than fair. They were generous, considering Daniel could have walked away with everything, and no one except his conscience would have stopped him. When can we sign? After we visit the site. Our elders need to see what's been protected, confirm these artifacts are what we believe they are. They arranged the expedition for 2 days later. Franklin Lawrence and the two elders would make the journey. Daniel would guide them through the tunnels to the ceremonial chamber Elijah had sealed over a century ago. Meanwhile, Marcus and Victoria's lawsuit proceeded with the mechanical efficiency of expensive legal machinery. Stanley Richter filed motions, demanded depositions, built a case on manufactured evidence, and the fundamental assumption that Daniel couldn't afford to fight back. Graham countered each move, but the disparity in resources was obvious. Richter had a team of junior associates doing research. Graham had himself and a paralegal who worked part-time. The law might be on Daniel's side, but money could stretch litigation until financial exhaustion forced surrender. Wednesday brought the site visit. Franklin and Lawrence arrived with the elders Sarah Redtail and Joseph Eaglefeather, both in their 70s but moving with the steady determination of people on sacred business. They descended into the mine with reverence, each step a return to something stolen and finally being restored. The main chamber drew quiet acknowledgement. The east tunnel's collapse elicited concern about structural integrity. But the west tunnel leading to the ceremonial chamber behind Elijah's false wall transformed the expedition into something approaching pilgrimage. Daniel had removed the stones the previous night, preparing access. The chamber beyond was larger than he'd realized, maybe 20 by 15 feet. Walls bore pictographs that had survived 800 years in darkness. Pottery shards and tool fragments lay exactly where Elijah's journal described hiding them. A woven basket, impossibly preserved in the dry air, sat in a natural alcove like an offering waiting for the righteous to claim it. Joseph spoke in Ute voice thick with emotion Lawrence didn't need to translate. The words carried meaning that transcended language, grief and joy and recognition bleeding through syllables. Sarah touched a pictograph, fingers trembling. My grandmother's grandmother may have stood here. This isn't history, this is family. They performed a blessing ceremony. Sage smoke filled the chamber, prayers in Ute, echoing off stone that had absorbed countless prayers before colonization, before silver rushes, before men like Elijah came seeking fortune and found responsibility instead. Daniel stood back, feeling the weight of what his ancestors had taken and what he was now returning. The silver in these mountains was worth 20 million, maybe more. But watching these elders reclaim what had been stolen, he understood his grandfather's choice. Some debts couldn't be calculated in dollars. Some promises mattered more than comfort. Franklin approached after the ceremony concluded, eyes bright with something between tears and vindication. Your great-great-great-great-grandfather took from us, but he tried to make it right. Your grandfather kept that promise alive. Now you're finishing what was started. There's honor in that. They spent hours documenting everything, photographing artifacts in situ before any were moved. Lawrence recorded GPS coordinates, made notes that would become part of the official record when the transfer was formalized. As they climbed back to the surface, Sarah pulled Daniel aside. Your siblings will hate you for this. Family often hates those who choose conscience over convenience. I know. But your daughter will understand, and someday her children will know that their great-great-great-great-great-grandfather chose to heal old wounds instead of profiting from them. That's a legacy worth more than silver. The trial date was set for 3 weeks out. Judge Ellen Morrison presiding, a woman in her mid-60s with a reputation for patience with legitimate claims and contempt for bullshit. Graham seemed cautiously optimistic. Morrison is fair. She won't be impressed by expensive lawyers or manufactured evidence, but your siblings have resources to drag this out if she doesn't rule decisively. Depositions began the following week. Stanley Richter questioned Daniel for 6 hours, probing every conversation with his grandfather, every visit to the mountain, every decision about the property. Did you visit your grandfather more frequently than your siblings in his final years? Yes. Did you discuss the mountain property during these visits? Sometimes. Did you know about potential mineral value before his death? Not until after. Richter pressed harder, trying to establish a pattern of manipulation. But now you know the property is worth millions. Graham objected, called it speculation, but the seed was planted. Daniel had visited more, knew more, stood to gain more. The narrative Richter was building didn't require truth, just plausibility. Victoria's deposition was next. She testified about their grandfather's supposed confusion, forgotten names, repeated stories. Classic signs of cognitive decline. She claimed evidence that he wasn't competent to make major decisions about estate distribution. Graham's cross-examination cut through the performance. How many times did you visit your grandfather in his final 2 years? Victoria's hesitation was brief but damning. 3 or 4 times. And you claim expertise about his daily mental state based on 4 visits spread across 24 months. I spoke with him by phone regularly. How regularly? Monthly. Graham let that sink in, then struck. Did he ever express a confusion about his estate plans during these monthly phone calls? Not directly. Yes or no, Miss Carter? No. Did you ever offer to help him manage his properties, his legal affairs, his medical care? Victoria's composure cracked slightly. He never asked. You're a lawyer. Did you ask if he needed help? I assumed he was handling it. Yet now you claim he was incompetent to handle it. Interesting assumption. Marcus fared worse. His deposition revealed that he'd hired private investigators to surveil the property before the will was even read, contacted mining companies for appraisals, tried to establish asset value while claiming ignorance. Graham pulled phone records, showed calls to Silver Point Mining 2 days after the funeral. You contacted a mining corporation before you even knew what your grandfather left you. Marcus's lawyer objected, but the damage was done. The jury would see greed, not grief. Calculation, not confusion. Between depositions and trial preparation, Daniel continued teaching. His students noticed the distraction, but most were too self-absorbed to care. Jamal was the exception. Mr. Carter, you okay? You seem stressed. The concern was genuine, rare in teenagers who'd learned early that adults were background noise in their personal dramas. Family stuff, nothing you need to worry about. My uncle sued my dad once, over money my grandma left them. It got ugly. Jamal's eyes held wisdom beyond his years, the kind that came from watching adults destroy relationships over things that wouldn't matter in 10 years. How'd it turn out? They don't talk anymore. Haven't in 5 years. My dad says winning the lawsuit was the most expensive thing he ever lost. The observation haunted Daniel through the rest of the day. Marcus and Victoria were his siblings. They'd grown up in different households after their mother left, but they shared blood, shared a grandfather who'd loved them even if he hadn't trusted them with his most important legacy. This lawsuit would destroy whatever remained of family bonds. Even if Daniel won, even if the court ruled in his favor, and the tribal agreement held, Marcus and Victoria would never forgive him. Christmas would become a memory. Sophie would grow up knowing her uncles only as people who had tried to steal her inheritance. That night, Marcus called. Daniel almost didn't answer, expecting more threats or legal posturing, but something in the timing late enough that business hours were over suggested this might be personal. Danny, we need to talk. Actually, talk not through lawyers. The use of his childhood nickname was deliberate, a callback to when they'd been family instead of adversaries. I'm listening. Victoria and I discussed it. We're prepared to offer $3 million. You keep the property, pay us each $1.5 million. We drop the lawsuit and walk away. $3 million was more than Daniel would see in a lifetime of teaching. It would solve every financial problem, fund Sophie's college, buy a house, provide security he'd never known. For a moment, the temptation was physical, a weight pulling at his resolve. No, wow. Marcus's frustration bled through the phone. Be reasonable. You can't afford to fight us. Even if you win, the legal fees will bankrupt you. I have allies you don't know about. The Indians you're giving away a fortune to. Daniel's voice went cold. Don't finish that sentence. If you want to know why Grandpa left this to me and not you, listen to how you talk about people whose sacred site we've been exploiting for over a century. It's business, Danny, money, resources, not some mystical obligation to people who lost a war 150 years ago. See you in court, Marcus. He ended the call, hands shaking with anger and something darker. His brother had revealed himself completely in that moment, stripped away any pretense that this was about fairness or family. Marcus saw people as resources, history, as irrelevant promises, as negotiable inconveniences. Their grandfather had known, had predicted this exact conversation probably. The video testament Frederick Morrison had mentioned suddenly became crucial. If Thomas had recorded his reasoning, explained why he'd chosen Daniel over his other grandchildren, it would demolish any claim of diminished capacity. Daniel called Graham. The video testament. When can we see it? I'll contact Frederick. We should view it before trial, make sure it supports our case. They met at Frederick's office 3 days later. The attorney had aged in the weeks since the will reading, stress and grief adding years to features that had already carried too much weight. Your grandfather recorded this 2 weeks before his death. He knew what was coming, predicted your siblings' response with unfortunate accuracy. The video began with Thomas sitting at the conference table where Daniel had first learned about his $5 inheritance. Thin but alert eyes, clear and focused with the intensity of someone determined to be heard beyond death. My name is Thomas Harold Carter. I am recording this of my own free will and sound mind and body to address what I know will be challenges to my will. His voice was steady, no tremor, no confusion. The medical documentation would confirm what the video showed, but seeing his grandfather this way, fully present and deliberate, struck deeper than any clinical assessment. Marcus and Victoria will contest my decisions. I expect this. I've known them all their lives. They value wealth and status above most other considerations. I don't say this with anger. I say it with sadness because I tried to teach them differently and failed. Daniel watched Marcus and Victoria's entire case disintegrate in the first 30 seconds. No diminished capacity here. No confusion. Just a man who knew his grandchildren and had made peace with their limitations. Daniel is different. He has integrity, patience, and the ability to see beyond surface value. The mountain property contains more than most people understand. Not just silver, though there's plenty of that. History, responsibility, purpose, promises made over a century ago that I've kept alive for 67 years. Thomas leaned forward, speaking directly to the camera. Daniel will discover what's there, and when he does, he'll make the right choices. Not the profitable choices, not the easy choices, the right ones. Marcus and Victoria would see only dollar signs. Daniel will see the story, the heritage, the debt we owe to people whose land we took and whose sacred places we violated in pursuit of silver. Graham paused the video, letting the words sink in. This destroys any claim of incompetence. He's articulating complex moral reasoning, demonstrating clear understanding of both material and ethical dimensions of his decision. The video continued. Thomas addressed his other grandchildren directly, voice carrying disappointment without bitterness. To Marcus and Victoria, you received substantial inheritances. The lakeside property, the antique collection. More than enough to live comfortably. But to Daniel, I'm leaving something more valuable. Trust. The trust that he'll honor promises made before he was born. The trust that he'll choose integrity over profit when the choice matters most. Thomas's eyes seemed to look directly through the camera, through time, finding Daniel in the future moment when this would matter most. Daniel, if you're watching this in a courtroom, it means I was right about your siblings. Don't let them diminish what you're doing. You're not fighting for money. You're fighting for the principle that promises matter, that heritage matters, that some debts transcend the generations that incurred them. Stand firm. I'm proud of you. The video ended. Frederick sat in silence while Daniel processed the weight of his grandfather's faith. Trust given without reservation, confidence placed before it was earned, belief that Daniel would rise to meet responsibilities most people would flee. Can we use this at trial? Graham was already making notes. Absolutely. This is devastating to their case. Morrison will see a competent man making deliberate choices based on values, not confusion. The contrast with your siblings' testimony will be stark. The trial began on a Monday morning that felt like walking into battle. The courtroom was smaller than Daniel expected, wood paneling, dark with aged windows, letting in light that felt judgmental. Judge Morrison presided from a bench that elevated her above the proceedings, face carved from professional neutrality. Daniel sat with Graham at one table. Marcus and Victoria occupied the other, with Stanley Richter, their expensive lawyer, radiating confidence that comes from winning more than losing. Sophie sat in the gallery with Rachel, who'd taken time off work to support their daughter through this. The jury looked tired already, 12 people pulled from their lives to arbitrate family dysfunction dressed as legal dispute. Daniel tried to read their faces, searching for sympathy or skepticism, but they'd mastered the blank expressions that kept lawyers from gaming the system. Richter's opening statement painted Daniel as a manipulator, an opportunist who'd isolated a vulnerable old man and poisoned his mind against his other grandchildren. Every visit became evidence of undue influence. Every conversation about the property transformed into conspiracy. Thomas Carter was 91 years old, in a Imam. His health was failing, his mind was vulnerable, and the defendant exploited that vulnerability for personal gain. He convinced his grandfather that his siblings didn't care, manipulated estate planning to ensure he inherited property worth millions, while they received comparative pittances. The narrative was fiction, but fiction told well enough to sound plausible. Richter had facts twisted just enough to support conclusions that had nothing to do with truth. Graham's opening was quieter, focused on character rather than conspiracy. Thomas Carter was sharp until his final day. He knew exactly what he was doing and why. He'd spent 67 years protecting something precious, and he needed to pass that responsibility to someone who would honor it, not someone who would exploit it, not someone who would sell it to the highest bidder. Someone who understood that the greatest inheritances aren't measured in dollars, but in the integrity of the choices we make with them. Victoria testified, first polished and prepared. She described their grandfather's supposed decline with the precision of someone who'd rehearsed every word. Forgotten names, repeated stories, moments of disorientation that added up to incompetence in her carefully constructed narrative. Graham's cross-examination was surgical. You visited your grandfather 3 times in his final 2 years. I have a demanding career. I'm sure you do. But based on 3 visits, you claim expertise about his mental state sufficient to override medical evaluations, legal assessments, and his own clearly stated wishes. Victoria's jaw tightened. I spoke with him regularly. Monthly phone calls where he never expressed confusion about his estate plans. Your testimony, not mine. Graham pulled out phone records, showed the pattern. 11 calls in the last year of his life, average duration 4 minutes. You spent 44 minutes total on the phone with your grandfather in 12 months, and you're asking this court to conclude he was incompetent. The jury shifted. One woman in the back row frowned, making notes. The accountant in seat 3 looked skeptical. Richter objected, tried to redirect, but the damage was done. Marcus's testimony followed the same pattern. He'd visited, rarely called, infrequently, offered no help with the practical realities of aging. But now he claimed their grandfather had been too confused to make sound decisions. Graham destroyed him with his own words. You hired investigators to surveil the property before the will was read. We needed to understand what we were dealing with. You called Silver Point Mining Corporation 2 days after your grandfather's funeral, before you even knew what the will said. Marcus's expensive suit suddenly looked like costume. We were exploring options. Options for property you didn't own and hadn't inherited. You contacted a mining company about land that belonged to your grandfather attempting to establish value for property that wasn't yours to assess. And you claim your concern was his well-being, not your profit. The lunch break brought reporters, photographers trying to capture images through courthouse windows. Small-town inheritance dispute had become news the tribal intervention, elevating it from family squabble to something with broader implications. Clarence found Daniel in the hallway, offered coffee from a thermos that probably predated statehood. Your grandfather would be proud. You're fighting for the right things. Even if I lose everything, especially then, anybody can do right when it's profitable. Takes character to honor promises when they're expensive. The afternoon session began with Graham's witnesses. Frederick Morrison testified about Thomas's competence, the careful deliberation that went into estate planning, the medical evaluations that confirmed sound mind. He was absolutely clear about his intentions, explicit that Daniel should inherit the mountain property because Daniel would understand its true worth, not just its market value. Richter attacked the medical evaluations, implied the doctors had been influenced, suggested financial incentives. But the records were thorough, multiple evaluations by independent physicians who had no stake in the outcome. Vernon Ashby took the stand, next geological expertise, lending weight to claims about the property's significance. The site represents one of the last undiscovered silver deposits in the Rocky Mountain region. But more importantly, it contains evidence of Native American ceremonial use dating back centuries. Thomas Carter spent decades documenting this, protecting it, preparing ethical frameworks for managing competing claims. Vernon looked directly at the jury. The level of sophistication in his documentation shows not just competence but expertise. This was the work of a brilliant ethical mind trying to do something right in a world that usually rewards exploitation over conscience. Then Lawrence Whitehorse took the stand, and the trial transformed into something larger than family dispute. Thomas Carter approached the Ute Mountain Ute Tribal Council 7 years ago, voluntarily. He wanted to return artifacts his great-grandfather had found on our sacred mountain. He spent years negotiating an agreement that would preserve our heritage while allowing his family to benefit from mineral rights. Judge Morrison leaned forward. There are indigenous artifacts on this property. Sacred items? Yes, Your Honor. Ceremonial objects, pottery tools. Items that belong to our people under federal heritage protection laws. Items that should never have been removed from the sites where our ancestors placed them. Richter tried to object, claimed this was beyond the scope of the will contest, but Morrison shut him down. Indigenous heritage is absolutely relevant to testamentary capacity. Continue, Mr. Whitehorse. Lawrence explained the 7-year negotiation, the draft agreement, Thomas's failing health, that prevented him from signing before his death. Daniel Carter has committed to honoring his great-great-great-great-grandfather Momo's promise and his grandfather's agreement. Marcus and Victoria have shown no such intention. They see artifacts worth millions that they want to sell. We see family coming home after a century of exile. The courtroom was silent when Lawrence finished. Even Richter seemed to recognize he'd lost control of the narrative. This wasn't about senile old men and manipulative grandsons anymore. This was about broken promises being kept stolen, heritage being returned, choices between profit and principle. Graham stood, addressed the judge directly. Your Honor, we have one final piece of evidence. A video testament Thomas Carter recorded 2 weeks before his death. We believe it addresses the competency claims directly. Morrison allowed it. The bailiff set up equipment, dimmed lights, and Thomas appeared on screen. Alert, focused, devastating to every claim Richter had made. The courtroom watched in silence as Thomas laid out his reasoning, explained his choices, predicted his grandchildren's responses with unfortunate accuracy. When he spoke directly to Daniel, voice carrying across death and time, several jurors wiped their eyes. Stand firm. I'm proud of you. The video ended. Morrison sat back, face still neutral, but eyes conveying volumes. I've heard enough. The will contest is denied. The evidence overwhelmingly shows Thomas Carter had full mental capacity and clear intent. Furthermore, the undue influence claim is baseless. Mr. Daniel Carter maintained a loving relationship with his grandfather while the plaintiffs abandoned him. That's not manipulation. That's family. The gavel fell. The will stands as written. Daniel Carter's ownership of the property is confirmed. Additionally, I note the tribal council's intervention. This court expects all parties to respect federal heritage protection laws governing the artifacts and sacred sites on this property. She looked directly at Marcus and Victoria, contempt finally breaking through professional neutrality. Your grandfather's video makes clear he anticipated your actions and found them predictable. That's not a compliment. This case is dismissed. The courtroom erupted in controlled chaos. Reporters rushed for doors, already filing stories about indigenous heritage and family betrayal. The tribal elders embraced Daniel Sarah, whispering prayers in Ute, while Joseph gripped his shoulders with surprising strength. Sophie ran from the gallery, wrapped her arms around Daniel's waist. "You won, Daddy. Grandpa knew you would." Rachel approached more slowly, Doug hanging back near the door. She hugged Daniel briefly, professional distance maintained, but warmth underneath. "You did the right thing." Sophie needed to see that. Marcus stood slowly, Richter already gathering materials with the efficient detachment of someone whose paycheck didn't depend on emotional investment. Victoria had left without a word, heels clicking on tile as she fled judgment. But Marcus walked toward Daniel, stopped a few feet away. His face carried something Daniel had never seen there before. Not quite shame, but recognition adjacent to it. "Grandpa knew us better than we knew ourselves, didn't he? He knew everyone he loved. But trust and love aren't always the same thing." Marcus nodded slowly, processing implications that would probably take years to fully understand. "The artifacts, the indigenous heritage stuff, you're really returning all of it. Every piece. That's worth millions. Probably more than the silver if you found the right collectors." "I know." Marcus studied his brother with the expression of someone encountering a foreign language they'd never bothered to learn. "Maybe he was right about you after all." Then he walked out, not quite reconciliation, but not complete rupture either. A door left slightly ajar where it might have been slammed shut. 6 months transformed the mountain. Professional engineers stabilized the tunnels, installed proper lighting and safety equipment. The cabin was restored enough to be functional while maintaining its essential character. The ceremonial chambers were sealed under tribal control, accessible only to Ute members for spiritual purposes. The dedication ceremony brought 50 people to the clearing where Daniel had first seen the cabin and thought his grandfather had left him nothing. Franklin and Lawrence led the Ute delegation, Sarah and Joseph performing blessings that filled the mountain air with sage smoke and prayers in a language that had survived despite centuries of attempts to erase it. Vernon Ashby came from Denver carrying photographic documentation that would become the basis for academic papers about preservation ethics and indigenous heritage. Clarence drove up from Copperfield with Mrs. Gaines from the library, both of them representing a town that had watched Thomas Carter's solitary pilgrimages for 3 decades and never asked questions they knew weren't their business. Even Frederick Morrison made the trip, the attorney who'd read a will that seemed insulting until it revealed itself as the most valuable inheritance any of them would ever receive. The bronze plaque was simple words chosen carefully to honor all the promises that had converged in this place. This site honors Elijah Thorne, 1847 to 1903, Thomas Harold Carter, 1930 to 2021, and the Ute people who first knew this mountain as sacred, preserved through covenant between generations, protected for generations to come. Daniel and Sophie pulled away the cloth together, revealing words that would outlast all of them. The crowd applauded, quiet acknowledgement that some victories matter more than others. Daniel spoke without notes, trusting his heart to find words his head couldn't have written. "My grandfather taught me that inheritance isn't just about what we receive. It's about what we choose to do with it." This mountain held silver, yes. But more importantly, it held stories, history, responsibility. Promises made over a century ago by a man who realized too late that he'd built his fortune on someone else's sacred ground. He looked at Sophie, who stood with the woven bracelet Joseph had given her, visible on her wrist. "This is for my daughter and all the children who come after, so they know that some promises transcend lifetimes. That the greatest inheritances aren't measured in dollars, but in the integrity of the choices we make with what we're given." Sarah approached Sophie after Daniel finished, removed a woven bracelet from her own wrist. "This is symbol of covenant. Your father honors the old ways. You will carry this forward." Sophie accepted it with the seriousness it deserved. "I promise." The museum director from Denver Natural History announced the partnership that would display the silver specimens, 50% of proceeds funding tribal cultural programs. Not charity, but restitution. Not generosity, but justice delayed by a century and finally being served. After the formal ceremony ended, after the crowd dispersed, and the reporters left, and the official business concluded, Daniel and Sophie sat on the cabin porch watching stars emerge. The same stars his grandfather had taught him to navigate by the same constellations that had guided travelers before telescopes and satellites made the sky something to ignore rather than read. Do you think Grandpa knows what we did? Sophie's question carried the weight of grief still fresh, despite 6 months having passed. I think he knew what we'd do before we did it. That's why he trusted us. They watched darkness deep in the Milky Way, becoming visible as a river of light across the sky. Daniel pulled out his grandfather's pocket watch, wound it with the same careful movements Thomas had performed every morning for 67 years. Time reveals all truths. The inscription had seemed mysterious once. Now it was simply accurate. Time had revealed Elijah's promise to Dakota. Time had revealed Thomas's 67 years of faithful stewardship. Time had revealed which of his grandchildren would choose conscience over convenience when tested. Daniel opened his grandfather's journal, the one Thomas had kept in recent years, and wrote in the blank pages at the end, "We honored your promise today. The mountain is protected, the artifacts returned, the story preserved." Sophie knows her heritage now. She understands that wealth isn't what you hoard, but what you give forward. The inheritance you left wasn't silver, it was wisdom. And I'm passing it on just as you passed it to me, just as Elijah passed it to you. Thank you for believing I'd understand. Thank you for waiting until I was ready. Time revealed all truths just like you promised, with love and gratitude. Daniel, he set the pocket watch on the mantle inside the cabin where it would keep time for whoever came next. The mechanism ticked steadily each second, a promise kept each minute, a debt honored. Sophie fell asleep against his shoulder, exhausted from excitement and ceremony. Daniel carried her inside, settled her in the sleeping bag they'd brought for the night. They'd sleep here in his grandfather's cabin under the same roof where Thomas had plotted his careful preservation of promises made before either of them was born. The silver had made Daniel wealthy by any objective measure. The museum contract had yielded $8 million, enough to buy a house fund Sophie's education provide security he'd never imagined. He still taught American history to teenagers who mostly didn't care, but now the choice was deliberate rather than compulsory. Marcus had sent an email 2 months after the trial, brief, awkward, not quite apology, but acknowledgement adjacent to it. Saw the museum exhibition. The plaque mentions our family. I told my kids about Grandpa Thomas and about you. Maybe someday I'll understand what you understood. Small hope, probably futile, but Daniel had responded anyway. Doors left open had a way of surprising you given enough time. Victoria hadn't contacted him at all. Some wounds ran too deep for casual healing. Some pride couldn't bend far enough to admit error. Daniel made peace with that understanding that you couldn't force people to value what they'd been taught to ignore. Rachel had been right about one thing. Winning the lawsuit had been expensive, in ways that had nothing to do with money. Family gatherings would never recover. Christmas would be awkward at best. Sophie would grow up knowing her uncles as people who tried to take what wasn't theirs rather than as family who could be trusted. But she'd also grow up knowing that her father had chosen principle over profit when it mattered. That he'd honored promises made by ancestors he'd never met to people who'd been wrong generations before he was born. That integrity sometimes cost everything and was still worth the price. 3 years later, Sophie was 12. She led a school group to the mountain presenting a history project about Ute heritage and the covenant between generations that had preserved it. Lawrence Whitehorse attended proud as any grandfather watching legacy continue through children who understood what their parents' generation was still learning. Daniel watched his daughter explain the pictographs in the ceremonial chamber, the pottery that had been returned to tribal museums, the ongoing partnership between the Carter family and the Ute Mountain Ute people. She spoke with authority beyond her years, confidence that came from knowing her place in a story larger than individual ambition. My great-great-great-great-great-grandfather took from these mountains. My great-great-great-grandfather tried to make it right. My grandfather kept that promise alive for 67 years. My father finished what they started, and someday I'll pass it to my children, because some promises matter more than the people who make them. The students listened with the half attention teenagers give anything that doesn't immediately relate to their social survival. But a few took notes, asked questions, seemed to grasp that they were witnessing something rare. An inheritance that measured value and honor rather than dollars and promises kept, rather than wealth accumulated. That night, Daniel and Sophie camped at the cabin like they'd done dozens of times over the 3 years since the trial. Rachel had remarried not Doug, but someone better suited to her ambitions. The custody arrangement had shifted to something more equitable, recognition that Daniel's apartment had become a house, and his financial stability no longer required constant scrutiny. Sophie sat by the fire sketching the cabin by firelight, her artistic talent blooming into something that might become career or might just be quiet pursued for its own sake. Either way, Daniel wouldn't push. He'd learned from his grandfather that the best inheritances were opportunities, not obligations. Dad, when I'm grown up, what will I do with the mountain? The question deserved thought. Daniel poked the fire, watching sparks rise toward stars. Whatever feels right to you. But you'll know, because Grandpa trusted me and I trust you. Will you write me a letter like Grandpa wrote you? The idea hadn't occurred to him, but of course she was right. Every generation needed guidance from the one before wisdom passed forward, like the pocket watch that still kept perfect time after 90 years. Already started it. It's in the archive room, waiting for when you need it. Sophie returned to her sketching satisfied. The fire crackled, wood popping as sap ignited. An owl called from the forest, ancient sound that had filled these mountains since before humans arrived with their claims and their greed and their occasional attempts at redemption. Daniel looked up at the stars, thinking about Elijah descending into darkness over a century ago, making a promise to Dakota that he'd protect what he'd found. Thinking about his grandfather carrying that promise through 6 decades, maintaining tunnels and documenting artifacts, and waiting for someone who would understand. Thinking about Sophie, who would carry it forward when he was gone, and her children after that, and their children beyond them. An inheritance that measured success not in accumulated wealth, but in promises honored across generations that would never meet, but remained connected by choices that echoed through time. The mountain stood silent under starlight, keeping its promises the way it had for millennia. Elijah's silver still glinted in walls that would never be fully excavated, protected by agreements that valued preservation over profit. The ceremonial chambers held prayers in a language that predated English, would outlast, it would continue long after everyone currently living had returned to the earth they'd temporarily borrowed. This was what his grandfather had understood, and Marcus never would. That the greatest treasures weren't found in the ground, but in the choices people made when tested. That inheritance wasn't about what you received, but about whether you proved worthy of what was entrusted to you. That some debts transcended the generations that incurred them, and the only way to honor the dead was to keep their promises to the living. Daniel Carter had inherited $5 in a mountain cabin. He'd discovered $20 million in silver and priceless artifacts. He'd chosen to honor a promise made by a great-great-great-great-grandfather to people whose sacred land had been violated in pursuit of fortune. And in making that choice, he'd inherited something far more valuable than silver or land or money that would spend itself into nothing within a generation. He'd inherited his grandfather's legacy of integrity, the knowledge that he'd been tested and hadn't failed, the certainty that when Sophie faced her own tests, she'd have an example to follow of someone who chose right over easy and never regretted it. The fire burned low. Sophie yawned, gathered her things, headed inside to sleep. Daniel stayed outside a moment longer, hand resting on the pocket watch in his jacket. Time reveals all truths, the inscription promised. And time had proven his grandfather right about everything. About Marcus and Victoria. About Daniel himself. About Sophie and the generations that would follow. Some promises were worth keeping, even when they cost everything. Some legacies mattered more than comfort. Some choices defined not just who you were, but who everyone who came after you would have the chance to become. Daniel wound the watch, felt its familiar weight settle in his palm. The mechanism ticked steadily, measuring seconds that became minutes, that became years, that became the space between promise and fulfillment. He'd kept his grandfather's faith, honored Elijah's vow, protected what needed protecting, and returned what needed returning. Not because it was easy, not because it was profitable, but because it was right. And in the end, that was the only inheritance that truly mattered.